Good afternoon, everyone. This is a very large and impressive audience. It's my pleasure to be here for this talk. Also, I need to thank my prior speaker, Ian, for giving the most fabulous introduction to what I'm about to say. You can see my title here, AI in HR, Trick or Treat, as well as being kind of slick. It's my attempt to capture the focus of, we see and we hear a lot out there that's really impressive. It's terribly cool. Does it actually work? Could it work for me in my organization? And to make that work, how do I ensure that that is a success for me? I'll say right away, I'm emphatically not an expert on AI. I'm much closer to the position of, I think, many of you in, it's my job in the organization to look at these new things and try to make them work. My role at Schneider is to look at new HR technology, including AI, particularly in the areas of assessment and selection, and to advise the organization on what to pilot, what to use, and how to implement those changes. So, the risk of stating the obvious, digitization really has become the driving force of our time. We've heard a lot about some of the dimensions there. Many of these I don't really need to say much more about. Consumerization of tech expectations, organizations like Apple, Amazon, Uber have set the bar very, very highly. And as we've just heard, we use these kind of apps to interact with technology in our personal lives. We then come to work and very often we find something a little bit different. Prevalence of social media has been an interesting one. Yes, so what? We're now in a situation where it's not just organizations assessing candidates, but candidates assessing organizations. And social media allows those impressions and views to be shared very widely with other candidates, customers of the organization. So it's very much more a two-way process. Internet of Things, predicted to be 50 billion connected devices on the internet in 2020, which is not that far away now. What does that mean? It means smart devices are ubiquitous. They're going to be everywhere in personal life and in working life. AI has been one of the key themes of this session and these talks. We've heard about machine learning, but actually what this has really enabled is much larger sets of data to be accessed, so machine learning can actually work on that to form the algorithms that allow AI to be effective in these applications and allow it to be mainstream. It's that affordability and accessibility that's vitally important. No surprises, this kind of force for change has been a huge disruptor to industries, to markets, and, for good or ill, at the moment, HR. So there's a huge amount of pressure on HR to change, and I'm sure many of you are feeling that right now. Pressures come from a number of different directions. First is from business leadership. HR analytics was a new force a little while ago. It's growing in many of our organizations. Pressure from the top really is to have data-driven decision-making around people and talent in alignment with the other parts of the business, the other functions. Also, I don't think there are many companies out there of any size that would say, well, we're not digital and we don't want to be digital. So there's a great pressure, a great need to have a unified digital face of all the aspects of our brand, to our customers, to our employees, and to potential employees. Next area, I think, of pressure, as we've been hearing, comes from employees and candidates. The expectations are actually very, very high. But the important thing here is this is not just about a slick interface. It's not just about the technology. It's also about greater transparency, a fair and a job-relevant assessment experience for both candidates looking inside the organization and employees looking for job changes and looking for learning inside the organization. But I'll be saying a bit more about that in a moment. And then finally, there are also constraints. There's also oversight from government and in the area of public opinion. Privacy, unbiased assessment and selection, these are not really new. But because we're talking digital, because there's the ability both to see and to retrospectively analyze, the spotlight is really on here. Some of you might be involved with the EU's GDPR, the General Data Protection Requirement. The US has always been very strong with its Equal Employment Opportunities Commission to actively seek out and prosecute cases where assessment selection tools have been used that bias independent groups. A lot easier to do that when they can access the kind of big data that we're talking about. So what am I going to do today is to try to focus on a couple of the areas that AI and HR New Tech can touch. As Ian was just saying, this is actually a very broad-ranging set. There are now hundreds of vendors. I'll be spending a bit more time looking at assessment and selection, performance, coaching and development, to share what I think are some of the success factors and the pitfalls to avoid. And I'll also be sharing an internal case study from Schneider on a pilot that we're running around internal mobility and career development, which is maybe a less typical application. So assessment and selection, probably the area that you associate most with AI, and maybe you've even had the most approach from vendors. Gamified and game-based tests, video simulations and virtual reality simulations. Video simulations, not so high-tech. It can be something online. It's the equivalent of a role play in the old face-to-face selection days, perhaps. VR, something different. I saw a demonstration recently of a tool that Walmart are actually using to select store managers, where an Oculus Rift headset gives you a virtual reality view, professionally filmed actors inside a store with all kinds of crisis and problem situations that the applicant has to respond to. Then we come on to AI-based applications. Assessment tools, probably the big one. An equal balance here, I think, of challenges and opportunities. The great challenge is really understanding what's going on and what's being measured. The opportunity is that these tools can be optimized and customized for your particular organization. Traditional psychometric tests are very carefully designed, but they're designed in a general way to be used by many organizations. If we're lucky, they're validated afterwards. What AI-based tools allow us to do is to build something specifically for one organization, so the validation happens up front. Obviously, great possible benefits in terms of saving time and saving cost. Opportunities to avoid traditional biases, but maybe also some risks for introducing new biases. In the interview process, many organizations, in fact, I could probably say most MNCs are now using video-based interviewing, sometimes in real time, sometimes so-called asynchronous, where the video is recorded. It is possible to actually score those in terms of facial expression, use of language, natural language processing. That's a little bit out there. Some organizations, I think, are experimenting with that, but very few have got to the stage of making that mainstream. What are we actually seeing out there? The rush to adopt is kind of showing mixed results. When things go well, you see statistics like this. When things go less well, you see newspaper stories like the famous Amazon one. What is this actually telling us? What can we learn from these cases of success and failure? I think the first one to bear in mind is however advanced the tool is, what are you using it for? You are trying to predict success. How easily can you measure success? The example on the left, and many of the success use cases that you'll see, may be sales, retail, customer service occupations where it's pretty easy with a single number or a few numbers to define what success actually is. Much harder for a management role. What can we learn about failure cases? I think the first is that AI is blind. It's driven from data. That's a great plus, but it can be a great minus. And in a case like Amazon, perhaps the routes to success in the past are not necessarily what we might want to be the routes to success in the future. So it's really important to understand what it is your algorithm is looking at. So then a few thoughts, recommendations on how to make a success of these new opportunities, a new world of assessment and selection. First is don't forget the basics. But even more today, be transparent and honest with your employees. Selection versus development. If it's actually selection, tell them it's selection. You need to know what success looks like to use any of these techniques, and you need to be able to measure that. think about how that needs to reflect the future as well as the past. And data privacy, I'm afraid we have to get used to it. It's the new normal. Increasingly, there'll be a higher and higher level of scrutiny. Those are the basics. What about elements particularly relating to these new tools? I think that my most fundamental, and it kind of chimes with what some earlier speakers have said this morning, use AI as a tool and as a supplement, but don't rely on it. There are elements that are not going to be in that algorithm, however thorough you are. That's the EI part, that's the human part, that's the vital addition of 1 + 1 = 3. You've got to understand what is in the black box, what is in the AI, what is in that algorithm. Understand how it was created, who created it, what kind of data samples and training data were actually used. And be very wary of bias. So there's a great opportunity to remove traditional biases, such as age or gender. But sometimes there are other variables in there which are correlated with those biases, so it's very, very hard to pull it out completely. Self-learning can also be a challenge. It kind of goes against the idea of actually understanding what is going on in that black box. And if you ever come to a situation in selection where you need to defend in a tribunal or a court of law or a works council on what basis you've made the decision, that can put you in a very tricky situation. Don't forget also perceptions. There's statistical predictive power, which is great, but tests have got to be perceived as fair and appropriate. What does appropriate mean? It means relevant. There's an interesting survey done by SHL last year about assessment trends, and they actually asked candidates at different job levels what they thought was a reasonable amount of time to spend on online assessment. And in some cases, it was long as an hour for senior roles. So my comment here about games for PhDs, if you were in a highly skilled role and you were applying for a job like that in an organization and you were being assessed on a 10-minute video game, how would you feel about that? And don't forget, for every person you select, there's a whole large number of people you will not select, and they have access to social media. In many cases, they might actually be your customers as well for many organizations. So it's very easy to make a poor impression, and that poor impression is going to be amplified. So fairness, appropriateness, extremely important. Shifting gears a little, not a primary application for AI, but one where technology is actually very important. Performance management, coaching and development. It's been a hot topic for the last 3 or 4 years in terms of moving away from so-called traditional annual appraisal ratings and towards continuous feedback. I mean, actually, that's always been best practice, but it's been very hard to achieve until mobile apps came along, which allowed people to give anytime feedback to each other and to nudge managers and employees that maybe it was time to provide feedback, have a check-in, update goals, etc. More specialized software such as OKR software, widely used in the IT industry for sharing project goals. Great opportunities for improving effectiveness there, removing duplications and synchronizing project teams. We are beginning to see AI in terms of curated learning. We're using a platform within Schneider to do just that. So rather than the traditional kind of learning management system approach where you have a slate of things you have to do, you're free to actually learn and access many of those materials yourself. And indeed, using apps for coaching, either directly to access a coach on video, or else providing support for coaching goals. So I said this trend towards rating lists and appraisal-free performance management has been in place for a few years. What are the lessons that have been learned? If we can generalize, I think you gain and you lose by doing away with annual appraisals and with ratings. Losing an annual appraisal frees up time from managers and from HR doing calibration, but it removes a sense of closure. As far as ratings are concerned, general finding that employees hate ratings, but The surprising, or maybe not so surprising fact is when you actually survey them after one of these changes, there's a resistance to having a more subjective summary, particularly when that applies to reward. So what we're beginning to see is surveys showing a negative impact of having a rating-free system, and many organizations who pioneered these systems have either moved back to introduce ratings, or in the case of one of the true pioneers that was written about a lot, like Deloitte, they've moved to quarterly rating summaries. So the moral is be very, very careful about why you're doing away with something and how you manage that. Feedback and coaching, I think the apps make it possible, but by themselves they're not sufficient to bring about behavior change. Skilling is still important, and broader change management is there. I think across the various cultures and businesses that I deal with, very, very few of those could say that coaching and feedback is really part of a manager's DNA. It's something we still have to work on. And if we are doing regular check-ins and feedback, it's no good having annual goals. Goals need to be things that are linked to tasks in the workplace that evolve quickly. So I want to end with an example from Schneider where I think maybe the urgency is unique for us. We're a very large and dispersed organization. We're in 100 countries. We have 150,000 staff. It's very hard for HR to keep up with changes to the organization structure, to understand what career and project opportunities there are around the organization. It's even harder for employees to actually get to see those. So OTM in AI, an open talent market pilot, has been introduced in the last 6 months. The objectives really are to open the doors, open the windows to employees to own their career. I'm sure many of you use that phrase in your own organization. For many people, that means job moves, not just the next piece of learning. But if we are looking at structured learning, the whole 3E model, the experience part is probably the area that has the most opportunities for gain, but it's hardest to realize. So what we're looking for here is giving employees not just access to their next role, but access to a critical development experience as well by way of a project. From the organization itself, we want to make sure we're developing talent pools and succession pipelines, and we're doing that in an efficient and agile way. So working with an external vendor, we've introduced a consumer-grade, very, very simple interface, which allows managers to post development opportunities, either roles or projects, and it allows employees to complete a profile. They can download their LinkedIn profile. And guess what? It's like a dating website for roles in the organization and for projects. So that makes it sound very simple. Actually, there is a fair bit of AI involved. Job descriptions are analyzed for content using natural language processing. An individual's profile is related to the length of years they've held each role, and attributions are made about the depth of skills that would normally be found in that role. So there are also input in terms of the matching and liking history for managers and employees. So what does that actually mean in practice? We've really got 3 groups we're looking at here. We're looking at the benefits for employees and for managers. So obviously for employees, it's transparency. It gives access to jobs. It gives access to projects. It removes the red tape of having to say to my manager, I'm kind of interested in a job move. Sometimes that doesn't go down so well. So employees will receive AI-supported suggestions of learning experiences, development areas, and roles they can take. For managers, without going to anyone, they can actually post details of a role or a project online, and that's immediately available to everyone who has uploaded their profile. There's a matching process, and hence the dating app. Both the candidate and the manager can say, these matches look kind of interesting. Candidate can ask some more information about the opportunity. A manager seeing an interesting candidate can ask some more information about the candidate and can actually arrange an interview. It's also important, and part of this process, part of the contracting, is that they give feedback to unsuccessful candidates as well. And then finally for HR, they're not spending huge amounts of their time chasing in a complex structure looking for suitable fits, for succession pipelines, or for roles. Much more of that is put in the hands of the manager. And it allows them to act as change agents in supporting a much more agile work of managing talent. And of course, think about this, all the information that's actually gathered in this system is available for HR analytics and also for HR to monitor in real time. So there are huge gains. So I'm going to go back to my question, trick or treat, AI in HR. I think my answer is it depends how you manage it. And my advice to all of you would be embrace the future, but keep your eyes open. Thank you.